All right, guys, it's time to apply everything that we've learned so far to our Keeper app project and make it actually have some functionality. If you head over to the course resources and fork your own copy of the Keeper Part 3 starting project, you'll notice that the challenge instructions are very simple. All we want to do is to be able to add notes and delete notes from our Keeper app. This is the final functionality that you're looking for. When we add a note with a new title, and when we click the add button, it clears those inputs and pushes a new note into our array of notes. So if we added another, then you can see they will just keep getting added alongside each other. The second part of the challenge is to be able to click on the delete button and for that note to be removed from the stack of notes here. Now, even though it sounds simple, there's only 2 steps. Each of these steps will involve quite a few things that you've learned along the way. If you want to get started with the challenge and you think you can tackle it already, then go ahead and pause the video and give it a go now. If you want to watch me break down the challenge into smaller pieces so that you can tackle it one by one, which is obviously a lot easier, then feel free to continue listening. All right, so the first part of implementing the add note functionality is probably going to involve some sort of state management, right? We're probably going to have to create a constant that keeps track of the title and content. In addition, when the new note with its title and content gets created, we're probably going to want to pass the new note back to the app component. And then maybe in the app component, we'll have some sort of array, right? Which we can add the new note to an array. And this array is probably going to be something with state, which you can set state and you can read it. And then we can take that array and render separate note components for each item in the array. And these substeps should together create the implement add note functionality. Now, the second step where we want to delete notes, we're probably going to need some sort of way of getting a callback from the note component that's going to trigger a delete function. The delete function is probably going to live in the app.jsx, and in this case, we're probably going to want to use the filter function to filter out the item that needs deletion. So you're going to have to think about how to pass an ID over to the note component so that when you trigger the delete function, you can pass it back to the app component in order to identify the note that needs to be removed from the array. So this is the broken down version of the challenge, and I recommend giving it a go and seeing how you get on. If you get stuck, then come back and watch me go through the solution step by step, and then maybe that will help you get unstuck and you can continue with the rest of the steps of the challenge. All right, so pause the video now and try to complete this challenge. All right, the first thing we're going to address is implementing the add note functionality. And the first sub-step of this was to create a constant that keeps track of the title and the content so that we can save what is typed into these 2 inputs. So I'm going to open up my components folder and go to this create area component. Now here you'll notice that there is a very simple form with an input, a text area, which acts pretty much like an input, and finally a button that just reads add. So we've only got 3 components, and we want to be able to save what's typed into this input under something called title, and this one under something called content. Let's go ahead and create our stateful constants. And I'm going to create a object, in this case, that contains both the title and the content. You could, of course, create separate constants, one for the title and one for the content, but it means you'll have to write more lines of code and do a little bit more work. I'm going to create a constant called note, and I'll create a function called setNote, which is going to update it. And I'm, of course, going to need to use state. The initial state is just going to be an object with a title key that's set to an empty string and a content key that's also set to an empty string. Now I can use this note inside my input and my text area. So I'm going to have 2 values, and this one is going to be equal to note.title, and this one will be note.content. Now that we've got our inputs controlled, the next step is to update them when they get changed. So inside the input and the text area, I'm going to add a onChange. And inside both of these onChange, I'm going to call a function which I'll call handleChange. And then we can pass it in as the onChange for both of these, like so. Now, handleChange is going to receive an event when it gets triggered. And in this case, we're going to destructure the event so that we get hold of the event.target.name and .value. So we're going to create a new destructured object using the const keyword. And this destructured object is going to tap into the event.target.name and event.target.value, like so. So now we can use this name and value as separate constants, and I'm going to add to my note by calling setNote. Now, setNote is going to be able to receive the previous note, and I'm going to use that to add to the existing note. So in my setNote, I'm going to return a new object with the previous note, and in addition, I'm going to add the new name and value. And remember that this syntax simply turns this name key from just the string name for the key to the actual value of this name constant. And this is, of course, the spread operator, which is going to spread all of the key value pairs that is currently in existence in our note, and it's going to add it to this final object. This way, when we start typing, then you'll see it being saved inside our state. So if I go ahead and click on my create area, extend my state object, this is a title, and this is the content. So if you're not seeing this, then there might be something that you're missing in your code. So this is the first step. We've created a constant that keeps track of the title and the content. The next step is to somehow pass this newly created note back to the app. So we know that we've got this note saved in this constant, and we know that we have a button called add, which is supposed to trigger this adding of the note functionality. So why don't we go ahead and add a onClick to this button and try to get this note that's been created here passed back to the app.jsx. So when this button gets clicked, we're going to pass it a function that should be triggered. So in this case, I'm just going to call that function submit note. And this submit note is going to be triggered here. Now, remember what we said about forms and buttons inside forms. Whenever you click on a button inside a form, the default behavior is to refresh the page. And you can see that if I type something in here and I click add, you can see the entire screen flashes and refreshes. So the first thing we need to do is to prevent this. So we can pass the event to this submit note, and the event is triggered by the onClick, and we can call event.prevent default. This way, you'll notice if I go back over here and I type something in here and I click add, notice how the screen is not flashing anymore. So I'm preventing this entire reloading of the page by using the event.prevent default, which we saw in previous lessons. The next thing to do is to somehow trigger a function that can pass this note back over to the app.jsx. And to do that, we of course have to pass in a function as a prop. So let's go ahead and create a function called addNote. And this addNote is going to receive a note object, and it's going to do something with that note object. So that addNote is going to be added as a value to one of the props for the create area. And you can call it anything you want, but I'm going to call it onAdd. And I'm going to set it to equal addNote. So now if we take a look at our components, when we head over to create area, it gets a prop under the property name of onAdd, and that is going to be equal to the addNote that comes from the app.js. Now we're going to trigger this addNote by getting hold of the props that gets passed over, and especially the props.onAdd. And calling this onAdd from the props is going to be equivalent to calling the addNote from the app.jsx. And in order for us to be able to add the note, we have to pass it back as an input. So in the onAdd, we're going to pass over the current created note, like so. Now we're pretty much done with our second step, which is passing the new note back to the app. And if you go into this add note and go ahead and try to log the note just to check that it works, then you can see that if I go ahead and just type some gobbledygook in here and click add, and I look in my console, then you can see that the only place where I'm logging it is inside my app component, inside the add note function, and I'm now able to receive this note and be able to log it right here. So all is good in the world. The next sub-step is to add this new note to an array. This is going to happen in our app.jsx, and that array is going to need state because it's going to be changed. Let's create a constant, and I'm going to call it notes to represent the plural nature of our array of notes. And then I'm going to create a function called setNotes, which is going to help me update this notes array. Then we of course have to use state and import state, and the initial value for my notes is just going to be an empty array. Instead of having this sort of sample note up here, I'm just going to start it out with no notes, and only when the user actually adds one does it get populated. Now that we have this notes array and we're receiving the new notes via this function, then we can think about how we can add to this notes array. So we can probably use the setNotes function, and inside this function we're going to get hold of the previous notes, or whatever is the previous value of this notes array, which at the moment it's empty, but soon it's going to be populated with note objects. And to add to this notes array, we're going to use the spread operator again, so that we get hold of all of the previous notes and then add the new note at the end. If you find it easier, it might be worth changing this property to new note. And remember, you can call it anything you want here, as long as you know that this value is being passed over from here. So now that we've created this array, we're going to have to return it to get rid of that little squiggly line, so that setNotes actually gets an array being returned, and that is going to be set as the new notes array. So now all we have to do is the last step, which is to take the array and render separate note components for each of the items in the array. Notice how we've got the squiggly line under notes, and it's because we're not using it anywhere. So let's do that right here. So at the moment, I've got a sample note being created, but instead of creating the sample note, I want to use my notes array and map through it to render a different note component for each item inside the array. My map is going to take a function, and I'm just going to create an arrow function in this case. And for each of the note items inside this notes array, remember that the map function is going to loop through this notes array and get hold of each of the note items inside and execute this function. Then I'm going to return a new note component, and this note component is going to need some properties passed over. So one of these is going to be the title, which is going to be set as note item dot title. The next is the content, which is going to be the note item dot content. And now, in order for this code to be recognized as JavaScript, I'm going to go ahead and select all of it and add the curly braces around it so that my errors go away. So now I can replace this static note with the notes that are created from my create note component. And if I go ahead and try it out, so I've got a title, this is a new note, and here's some content. I click add, and it gets added down in here. My array gets a new object with some title and some content, like so. That's step 1 completed, implementing the add note functionality. Step 2 is to implement the delete note functionality. And the first step of doing this involves creating a callback from the note component to trigger a delete function. Inside our note component, we have a delete button. And what we want to do is to be able to somehow get this delete button to trigger a function in the app.jsx. And to do this, we're going to have to rely on our props. We're going to have to tap into the onClick attribute here. And when the button gets clicked, we're going to handle the click. And I'm going to create a function up here, which is going to be called handle click. Now, you can of course have this as an inline anonymous arrow function if you want, but I'm just going to keep it separate so that it's a little bit easier to see what's going on. Now, inside this handle click is where we're going to trigger a function that gets passed over from the props that will delete this note from the array. So back in our app component, we're going to create another function below the add note, which is going to be delete note. And we're going to need the ID of the note that needs to be deleted. And then this function, as it is going to be passed over to each of these notes that gets rendered as a property. So I'm going to call it onDelete, and I'm going to add it inside here. Delete note as the function that's going to be passed over. So now if we go ahead and create a note and add it, and we click on the note component in our React Dev Tools, you can see that it's got a prop called onDelete that we can tap into, which is going to trigger the delete note function. Inside our note.jsx, inside the handle click function, we're going to tap into props.onDelete. And that's going to trigger this function right here. So let's go ahead and log that this delete was triggered. And now if I go ahead and create a new note, click add and click delete, then you can see that delete was triggered, gets printed in the console. So we're now able to trigger our delete note function in our app component, but instead of console logging, we're probably going to want to somehow remove the note from our notes array. So we can do that using set notes. And inside set notes, we can get hold of the previous notes just as we did up here. So let's go ahead and create a new arrow function which uses the previous notes. Now, once we have access to all of the previous notes array, well, then we can loop through it using the filter function. And remember that the filter function takes a function that accepts up to 3 arguments. We can go ahead and add an arrow function inside. So this is our function that's being passed to our filter function, and it can take up to 3 arguments. The first one is the value that we're currently looping through in the array. So that's going to be the note item. And the second one is the index of this item. So that's going to be really useful very shortly when we're going to be checking to see which ones we want to filter out. Inside our filter function, we're going to return all of the notes where the index does not equal the ID of the note that needs to be deleted. So this way, we should end up with an array that contains everything in the previous notes other than the ones where the index matches the ID of the note to be deleted. And we're going to need to return it in order to set it as the new notes array. The last thing we need to do is somehow pass over the index of the note that is being deleted through this delete note function. Now, at the moment, when we create our note, we actually don't pass over, firstly, the required key attribute, but also some sort of ID attribute that we can then pass back when we want to delete that note. This is the last step in the challenge. Somehow pass an ID over to the note component and pass it back to the app when deleting. How do we create this ID? We can, of course, create the ID using a UUID or some sort of timestamp that's unique, but the simplest way in this case is to know that map works very similarly to filter, in that in the callback function you can have the value, but you can also get the index of the current item that's being looped through. Let's go ahead and add a set of parentheses around our note item, because we're going to add a second parameter, which is the index. And we're going to use that index both as the key and also as the ID. When each of these note components are rendered, we're going to be passing over the index of the note item from the notes array as the ID, which we can then pick up inside our note component, so that when we call props.onDelete, we pass over that prop ID. So we can tap into props.id and send it back when we trigger the onDelete. So now if we hit save and we check it out, so let's create a new title, a new note, and click add. And then if we click delete, it will disappear from the array. Now, the last little bug that you might want to address is when you click on the add button, the title and the content should really clear itself. So how can we do this? Well, inside our create area, once we've submitted the note, we can also clear out this note object. We can call setNote and we can pass it the same object that we had to begin with. This way, when we call submit note, the note gets added over to our app.jsx and we set the note state to both an empty title and an empty content. And because our input has the value of note.title, our text area has a value of note.content, it should reflect the state of the notes. Let's try it out. If we type something in title, type something in the notes, click add, and they both disappear and go back to the original placeholder text. So this is the solution to the full challenge, and it's a really long one and it's a really hard one, but there isn't anything that you haven't learned in previous lessons. So if you got stuck in any of these places, then be sure to head back to the relevant section where we covered it, so that you can get a little bit more familiar with each of these steps so that you could complete this challenge comfortably by yourself. Now, all we have left is some tidying up. And in the next lesson, I want to show you how you can add some dependencies using React to get hold of some components that we can use in our React apps. So for all of that and more, I'll see you there.